May 1, 1943. 2:47 p.m. Somewhere over the English Channel, between France and England, a Boeing B-17 flying fortress is dying. The radio compartment is an inferno. Flames are crawling through the fuselage like living things, hungry and unstoppable. The aluminum skin of the aircraft is peeling back from the heat. Ammunition is cooking off, .50 caliber rounds exploding in random directions, shrapnel screaming through the smoke-filled interior. The oxygen system has been destroyed. Vital control cables have been severed. The aircraft is hemorrhaging fuel from punctured tanks, leaving a black trail across the sky. 3 crewmen have already bailed out, choosing the frigid waters of the English Channel over the inferno consuming their aircraft. 2 others are bleeding out from shrapnel wounds, unable to move, unable to help, barely able to breathe. And standing alone in the middle section of this dying bomber, surrounded by fire and smoke and chaos, is a 5 feet 6 inches staff sergeant that nobody wanted to fly with. His name is Maynard Harrison Smith. His nickname is Snuffy. He's been in England for exactly 6 weeks. This is his first combat mission. He has perhaps 90 minutes to save this aircraft and everyone's still aboard it, or they all die together. The pilots can't help him. They're trapped in the cockpit, cut off by a wall of flame, fighting desperately to keep the crippled bomber in the air. The other gunners can't help him. They're either dead, wounded, or floating somewhere in the cold waters below, praying for rescue that may never come. It's just Snuffy. Alone. In a burning airplane. 20,000 feet above the ocean. And German fighters are still out there, circling, waiting to finish what they started. What happens next will make Maynard Snuffy Smith the first enlisted airman in the history of the United States military to receive the Medal of Honor. But here's the thing you need to understand about Snuffy Smith. When the Secretary of War flew all the way to England to personally present him with that medal, the highest honor his country could bestow, they couldn't find him. He was in the kitchen. Peeling potatoes. Punishment for showing up late to a briefing. This is the story of the hero nobody liked. Maynard Harrison Smith was born on May 19, 1911, in Cairo, Michigan, a small town about 90 miles north of Detroit. His father, Harrison Smith, was a successful attorney. His mother was a schoolteacher. By small-town Michigan standards of the early 20th century, the Smiths were wealthy, comfortable, respectable. And Maynard knew it. From an early age, young Maynard developed a reputation around Cairo that would follow him for the rest of his life. He was spoiled. Entitled. A troublemaker. The kind of kid who believed, deep in his bones, that rules applied to everyone except him. His parents recognized the problem. They weren't blind to their son's character flaws. They tried to fix him. In the 1920s, when Maynard was still a teenager, they made a decision. They sent him to Howe Military Academy in Indiana, a prestigious boarding school specifically designed to instill discipline, honor, and military bearing in difficult boys from good families. It didn't work. Maynard graduated from Howe in 1929. He received his diploma, shook the headmaster's hand, and walked out the gates with his personality completely unchanged. If anything, the military structure had only taught him how to better game the system, how to find loopholes, how to do the absolute minimum required to get by. He bounced between jobs after graduation. The U.S. Treasury Department hired him for a while. Then the Michigan Banking Commission. Nothing stuck. Nothing interested him. He had no particular skills, no burning ambition, no sense of purpose or direction. In 1929, the same year he graduated from Howe, Maynard got married. By 1932, he was divorced. Then, in 1934, his father died. Harrison Smith left behind a substantial estate. And Maynard, now 23 years old, made a decision that would define the next several years of his life. He quit his job and lived off his inheritance. No work. No responsibility. No obligations. Just a man in his 20s and early 30s, coasting on his dead father's money, moving from place to place, doing exactly as he pleased, convinced, absolutely convinced, that he was smarter than everyone around him. The money, of course, didn't last forever. By the early 1940s, Maynard Smith had burned through most of his inheritance. He was in his early 30s, unemployed, and facing a new problem. He had a son from his first marriage. And he hadn't been paying child support. The court wasn't happy about that. America is now fully engaged in World War II. Young men across the country are volunteering in droves, eager to fight the Nazis, to defend democracy, to be part of something larger than themselves. Maynard Smith isn't one of them. At 31 years old, he finds himself standing in a Michigan courtroom, listening to a judge explain his options. The judge looks at this unemployed, arrogant man who has failed to meet his basic obligations as a father, and offers him a choice. Jail. Or the military. On August 31, 1942, Maynard Harrison Smith enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces. Not because he wanted to serve his country. Not because he felt called to fight fascism. Not because he believed in the cause. Because it was better than prison. But here's the thing about the Army Air Forces in 1942, they needed bodies. Specifically, they needed aerial gunners. The strategic bombing campaign over Europe was chewing through aircrews at a horrific, almost unimaginable rate. Every mission over Germany meant flak, fighters, mechanical failures, weather, human error. Men were dying faster than the training schools could replace them. And aerial gunners, the men who manned the .50 caliber machine guns on B-17 and B-24 bombers, had one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire war. They also got automatic promotions to non-commissioned officer rank. Staff sergeant. Better pay. Better status. Maynard Smith volunteered for aerial gunnery school. Not for glory. Not for patriotism. For the paycheck. After completing gunnery school at Harlingen Army Airfield in Texas, Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith was shipped across the Atlantic to England. He was assigned to the 423rd Bombardment Squadron, 306th Bomb Group, based at RAF Thulea in Bedfordshire, about 50 miles north of London. His reputation preceded him. Within days of arriving at Thulea, Smith had managed to alienate almost everyone on the base. He was obnoxious. Insubordinate. Condescending. He had zero combat experience but spoke to veteran airmen as if he knew better than they did. He was 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed maybe 130 pounds soaking wet. At 32, he was older than most of the other gunners. He was gray-haired, red-eyed, flat-footed, and absolutely insufferable. The other airmen started calling him Snuffy. The nickname came from a popular comic strip of the era called Barney Google and Snuffy Smith. The character Snuffy Smith was a hillbilly, shiftless, bad-tempered, lazy, with no ambition other than to live life on his own terms and do as little work as possible. The nickname fit Maynard Smith perfectly. And here's how bad it was. In the 8th Air Force in 1943, replacement gunners were usually assigned to crews within days, sometimes hours, of arriving at their base. Combat losses were so high that experienced crews were constantly looking for new men to fill empty positions. Nobody wanted Snuffy Smith. For 6 weeks, he sat at Thulea while other airmen flew mission after mission. Crews would rather fly short-handed, literally go into combat with empty gun positions, than take Smith along. 6 weeks. That's how unpopular he was. But war doesn't care about popularity. War doesn't care if your crew likes you. Eventually, someone had to fly with him. On April 30, 1943, the mission board went up. St. Nazaire was one of the most heavily defended targets in occupied Europe. The U-boat pens there were built from reinforced concrete, virtually impervious to conventional bombing. The Germans knew how valuable the facility was. They protected it accordingly. American aircrews called Street Nazaire, Flak City, because of the sheer volume of anti-aircraft fire they encountered over the target. Staff Sergeant Maynard "Snuffy" Smith was assigned to fly as ball turret gunner on B-17F serial number 42 to 29649. The pilot was First Lieutenant Lewis P. Johnson, Jr., an experienced combat veteran. This was Johnson's 25th mission, his last flight before rotating home. After this, he was done. He'd survived his tour. The rest of the crew were also veterans. They knew what they were doing. They'd been through it before. Smith was the only rookie. At 0300 hours on May 1, 1943, the crews were awakened for the morning briefing. The weather was miserable. Overcast skies, drizzle, poor visibility. But the mission was still on. 78 B-17 flying fortresses would take off from various bases across England, form up into combat boxes, cross the English Channel, bomb the submarine pens at St. Nazaire, and return home. At least, that was the plan. The Sperry ball turret was arguably the most claustrophobic, terrifying position on a B-17 bomber. It was a glass and metal sphere, maybe 3 feet in diameter, mounted on the belly of the aircraft. The gunner sat inside with his knees pulled up to his chest, hunched over in a fetal position, rotating the turret manually to aim 2.50 caliber machine guns at attacking enemy fighters. The view was spectacular. You could see everything beneath the aircraft, the patchwork fields of France, the glittering ocean, enemy fighters climbing up from below. The experience was absolutely terrifying. You were completely exposed, hanging in space with nothing but thin plexiglass between you and 20,000 feet of empty air. If the aircraft took damage and had to ditch in the ocean, you had maybe seconds to crank open the hatch and pull yourself up into the fuselage before the bomber sank. If you were wounded, if the turret jammed, if the hand crank failed, you were trapped. Ball turret gunners had the second highest casualty rate of any crew position. Only tail gunners had it worse. Most ball turret gunners were chosen specifically for their small size. At 5 feet 6 inches and 130 pounds, Snuffy Smith fit the profile perfectly. He climbed into the turret as Lieutenant Johnson's B-17 lifted off from Thule and headed south toward the channel. The mission to St. Nazaire went smoothly. The formation encountered minimal resistance over the target. They dropped their bombs on the submarine pens, though whether they did any real damage to the reinforced concrete structures was doubtful, and turned for home. 2 hours later, they were approaching what they believed was the southern coast of England. They were wrong. The lead navigator had made a catastrophic mistake. In the heavy cloud cover, with limited visibility, he misidentified the coastline below. He thought they were over England, approaching home, safety, hot coffee, and debriefing. They were still over France. Specifically, they were over Brest, another heavily fortified German position on the northwestern tip of the Brittany Peninsula. The formation, thinking they were almost home, descended to 2,000 feet to get below the clouds. That's when the flak opened up. German anti-aircraft batteries hammered the American bombers. Fighters scrambled to intercept. Within minutes, the neat combat box formation dissolved into chaos as individual aircraft tried desperately to evade and survive. Lieutenant Johnson's B-17 took the worst of it. 20mm cannon shells from a German fighter ripped through the fuselage. One shell punctured the fuel tanks. Another destroyed the radio compartment. A third hit the waist section. A massive fire erupted in the radio compartment and spread rapidly toward the waist. The aircraft's oxygen system was destroyed. Vital control cables were severed. The hydraulics were failing. In the ball turret, Snuffy Smith's position lost power. The turret wouldn't rotate. The guns wouldn't fire. He was trapped in a useless glass bubble underneath a burning airplane, unable to defend himself, unable to help. He had to get out. Smith cranked open the ball turret hatch manually and pulled himself up into the fuselage. What he saw was chaos. Fire. Everywhere. The radio compartment was completely engulfed. Flames were spreading through the waist section. Smoke so thick he could barely see 3 feet in front of him. The temperature was already unbearable and rising by the second. 3 crewmen, Technical Sergeant Henry Bean, Staff Sergeant Robert Roy Folliard, and Staff Sergeant Joseph Bukacek, made a decision in that moment. They bailed out. They grabbed their parachutes, yanked open the waist door, and jumped into the English Channel, hoping to be rescued by air-sea rescue boats or passing ships. They were never seen again. All 3 men are still listed as missing in action. The tail gunner, Sergeant Roy Gibson, was badly wounded. Shrapnel had torn through his position. He was bleeding heavily and couldn't move. Up front, Lieutenant Johnson and his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Robert McCallum, were trapped in the cockpit. The fire had cut them off from the rest of the aircraft. They couldn't see what was happening behind them. They couldn't communicate with anyone in the back. They didn't even know who was still alive. For all they knew, they were the only 2 men left on the airplane. In the middle section of the B-17, surrounded by fire and smoke and exploding ammunition, stood one man. Maynard "Snuffy" Smith. The soldier nobody wanted. The troublemaker. The screw-up. The guy who'd been forced into the military to avoid jail. And he had a choice to make. He could grab a parachute and jump. Follow the other 3 men out the door. Take his chances in the channel. Hope for rescue. Nobody would blame him. The aircraft was clearly doomed. Or he could stay. What Snuffy Smith did over the next 90 minutes is almost impossible to believe. He didn't panic. He didn't bail out. He didn't freeze. He went to work. First, Smith checked on the wounded tail gunner. He crawled through the smoke and flames to Gibson's position at the very back of the aircraft. Gibson was in bad shape, bleeding badly from multiple shrapnel wounds, barely conscious. Smith administered first aid. He bandaged wounds. He applied pressure to stop bleeding. He did whatever he could to stabilize the man and keep him alive. Then he turned his attention to the fire. The flames were spreading steadily toward the fuel tanks. If they reached those tanks, the entire aircraft would explode. There would be no warning, no time to react. Just a massive fireball and debris falling into the ocean. Smith grabbed a fire extinguisher from its mounting bracket and attacked the blaze. He sprayed foam at the base of the flames, trying to cut off the oxygen, trying to stop the spread. When that extinguisher ran empty, he threw it aside and found another one. When that one ran out, he started looking for anything else that might work. Then the German fighters arrived. 2 Focke-Wulf FW-190 spotted the crippled B-17 trailing smoke and flames. They saw an easy kill. They moved in to finish it. Smith was the only crewman capable of fighting back. He ran to the left waist gun, a .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun mounted in an open window, and opened fire on the attacking fighters. Tracer rounds arced through the sky. The gun bucked against his shoulder. The Germans broke off, circled, attacked from a different angle. Smith ran to the right waist gun and fired from that position. Then he ran back to fight the fire. Then back to the guns. Then back to check on Gibson. Then back to the fire. For 90 minutes, Maynard Smith fought a 3-front war. Flames on one side. German fighters on the other. A wounded crewman who needed constant attention. The heat inside the fuselage became unbearable. The metal skin of the aircraft was so hot it was painful to touch. The spare ammunition stored in the waist section started cooking off, rounds exploding randomly, shrapnel ricocheting off the interior walls. Smith grabbed the exploding ammunition boxes and threw them out through the holes that the fire and German cannon shells had torn in the fuselage. Anything that wasn't bolted down went overboard. Equipment. Supplies. Burning debris. Every pound he threw out made the aircraft lighter, easier for Lieutenant Johnson to control, more likely to make it home. When the fire extinguishers were empty, Smith wrapped himself in whatever protective clothing he could find, jackets, blankets, anything, and attacked the flames with his bare hands. He beat at the fire. He smothered it with blankets. He ripped away burning insulation and threw it out of the aircraft. And when nothing else worked, when every extinguisher was empty and every blanket was burned, Maynard Smith urinated on the flames. Whatever it took. Up in the cockpit, Lieutenant Johnson didn't know what was happening behind him. The intercom was dead. He couldn't see through the wall of fire. He couldn't communicate with anyone. He just knew his aircraft was still flying. Somehow, despite the damage, despite the fire, despite the punctured fuel tanks and severed control cables, the B-17 was still airborne. Johnson nursed the crippled bomber across the English Channel. Every minute felt like an hour. The controls were mushy and unresponsive. Cables had been severed. Hydraulics were failing. The aircraft wanted to roll over and dive into the ocean. But it kept flying. Finally, mercifully, they crossed the English coastline. Johnson spotted an airfield, pre-Danak, on the southwestern tip of Cornwall, and lined up for an emergency landing. The B-17 touched down hard on the grass runway. And then it broke in half. The fuselage, weakened by fire and riddled with over 3,500 bullet and shrapnel holes, simply gave way. The aircraft split into two pieces right behind the wings and skidded to a stop. When rescue crews reached the wreckage, they found Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith standing in the debris. He was exhausted. Covered in soot and burns. His hands were blistered. His uniform was scorched. But he was alive. So was Sergeant Roy Gibson, the tail gunner he'd been treating for 90 minutes. So were Lieutenant Johnson and Lieutenant McCallum, the pilots who'd been trapped in the cockpit. Everyone who was still on the aircraft when it landed survived. Lieutenant Johnson was direct in his assessment. Maynard Smith was solely responsible for the return of the aircraft and the lives of everyone aboard. Without him, the B-17 would have exploded over the channel. Everyone would have died. The story of Snuffy Smith spread quickly through the 8th Air Force. Here was a first mission gunner, a man nobody wanted to fly with, a troublemaker, a screw-up, who had single-handedly saved a burning aircraft and its crew while fighting off German fighters for an hour and a half. The Army Air Forces saw a propaganda opportunity. America needed heroes. The war in Europe was brutal, grinding, expensive in blood and treasure. Public morale needed boosting. And Snuffy Smith's story was perfect, an ordinary man rising to extraordinary courage when it mattered most. On July 15, 1943, Secretary of War Henry Louis Stimson flew all the way to England to personally present the Medal of Honor to Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith. It would be the first Medal of Honor awarded to an enlisted airman in the European theater. The first awarded to a living recipient in that theater. A major ceremony was arranged at Thule. Press was invited. Photographers were ready. Senior officers assembled. There was just one problem. They couldn't find Snuffy Smith. A frantic search began. Officers checked his barracks. The mess hall. The flight line. The orderly room. Nobody had seen him. Finally, someone thought to check the kitchen. There he was. Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith, Medal of Honor recipient, standing over a pile of potatoes with a peeler in his hand. KP duty. Kitchen patrol. The classic military punishment for minor infractions. Smith had been late returning from a pass the night before. His commanding officer had assigned him to potato peeling duty as punishment. He'd completely forgotten about the medal ceremony. That was Snuffy Smith in a nutshell. He'd just performed one of the most heroic acts in the history of aerial combat. And 2 months later, he was still getting in trouble for the same petty infractions that had defined his entire military career. They pulled him out of the kitchen, cleaned him up, and rushed him to the ceremony. Secretary Stimson hung the Medal of Honor around his neck. Cameras flashed. Reporters took notes. Maynard Smith became a legend. The press loved the story. Andy Rooney, yes, that Andy Rooney, who would later become famous on 60 Minutes, was a young reporter for Stars and Stripes at the time. He wrote a front-page story about Snuffy Smith's heroism. The Office of War Information turned Smith into a symbol of American courage. He was interviewed, photographed, celebrated. Back at Philly, the reality was more complicated. Smith flew 4 more combat missions after receiving the Medal of Honor. But the stress of that first mission had taken its toll. He was diagnosed with what they called operational exhaustion, what we would now recognize as combat stress or PTSD. He was permanently grounded. And then his behavior problems resumed. Smith started signing his letters Sergeant Maynard Smith, M.H. putting the initials of his medal after his name like British officers did with their decorations. He used his hero status to skip duties, sleep late, avoid work. He wore out his welcome quickly. On December 17, 1944, Maynard Smith was reduced in rank from staff sergeant to private for poor job performance. A Medal of Honor recipient. Demoted. That almost never happens. Smith was sent home in February 1945 and discharged from the army in May, just as the war in Europe was ending. Despite everything, the demotion, the disciplinary problems, the difficult personality, he received a hero's welcome when he returned to Michigan. There was a parade. Speeches. Celebrations. America wanted heroes. And Snuffy Smith was one. Maynard Smith's post-war life was turbulent. He had legal troubles. Business failures. He married again, this time to a British woman named Mary Rayner, a USO volunteer he'd met in England. They had 4 children together. Smith worked for the Treasury Department again. He founded a magazine called Police Officer's Journal. He bounced from one venture to another, never quite finding his footing in civilian life. But he never denied what he'd done on May 1, 1943. If anything, he embraced it. Sometimes he embellished the story over the years, adding details that may or may not have been accurate. That was Snuffy. Until the end, he remained exactly who he'd always been. Maynard Snuffy Smith died on May 11, 1984, in St. Petersburg, Florida. He was 72 years old. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery, Section 7A, Grave 159, LH, the same hallowed ground where presidents and generals rest. Let's put Snuffy Smith's actions in perspective. For 90 minutes, he fought a fuel-fed fire that threatened to destroy the aircraft, administered first aid to a critically wounded crewman, manned both waist guns to fight off attacking German fighters, threw exploding ammunition out of the burning fuselage, stripped away burning debris to prevent the fire from spreading, extinguished flames using fire extinguishers, clothing, blankets, and when nothing else worked, his own urine. He did all of this on his first combat mission. With no experience. While 3 of his crewmates were bailing out and 2 others were too wounded to help. The B-17 had over 3,500 holes in it when it landed. It broke in half on the runway. And everyone still aboard survived. Snuffy Smith was the first enlisted airman to receive the Medal of Honor during World War II. Only 4 others would receive it during the entire war for actions in the air. His story is complicated. He wasn't a noble hero from central casting. He was difficult, arrogant, often his own worst enemy. But on May 1, 1943, when his aircraft was on fire and his crewmates were dying and German fighters were trying to finish them off, Maynard Smith became something more than the sum of his flaws. He became exactly what was needed at exactly the right moment. That's the thing about heroism. It doesn't care about your personality. It doesn't care if people like you. It doesn't care about your past mistakes or your character flaws or whether you're easy to get along with. It only cares about what you do when everything is falling apart. For 90 minutes over the English Channel, Snuffy Smith fought fire, fought Germans, and fought to keep his crewmates alive. The soldier nobody wanted to fly with saved everyone who flew with him. And when the Secretary of War came to give him the highest honor his country could bestow, he was in the kitchen peeling potatoes. That's the story of Maynard "Snuffy" Smith. The hero nobody liked.